Today we are looking at a case from the late 19th century, so sit back as we go to New Zealand. Minnie Dean was born on the 2nd of September 1844 in Greenock, a coastal town in the West Central Highlands of Scotland, about 25 miles from Glasgow. She was the fourth child of 8 girls, and her father, named John McCulloch, worked as a railway engineer. Her family always referred to her as Minnie, but when she was just 13 years old, her mother died. In 1868, Minnie arrived in New Zealand. She travelled to the small city of Invercargill in Southland, the country's southernmost region, and accompanied by her 2 young daughters, stayed with an elderly lady, affectionately known as Granny Kelly. New Zealand had seen a large increase in immigration in the 1860s, largely due to the discoveries of gold in Otago in 1861 and Westland in 1865. Many people who arrived were from Britain and Ireland. Minnie told people that she was a widow and that her husband had been a doctor in Tasmania, but had sadly died. This seemed to be a plausible story, but strangely, she still referred to herself by her maiden name of McCulloch. 4 years after arriving in New Zealand, she married a gentleman named Charles Dean. Charles owned an inn, which had prospered during the years of the gold rush, but when the gold rush ended and far fewer gold prospectors came to the area, its fortune started to decline. So in 1886, the couple moved to the small town of Winton, where Charles took up farming. Farming was extremely important to New Zealand's economy, and wool was the country's single most valuable export. New markets, however, were beginning to develop. 4 years earlier, in 1882, the first frozen meat was transported from New Zealand to Britain. Charles was determined to build up his business and take advantage of the improved opportunities. Farming, however, was hard. Long hours of physical work, often in very harsh conditions, and unfortunately, Charles was unable to make very much money from his endeavours. The couple were unable to repay a loan that they had taken out, which was secured against their property. So in 1887, they moved into Winton and purchased a nice house in the town. Fortune again didn't favour them, as a fire broke out and the house burnt to the ground. Fortunately, no one was injured in the incident. Although down on his luck, Charles got to work and built a small dwelling for him and Minnie to live in. He also bought some pigs, which he thought he could turn into a profitable business. Minnie was keen to help her husband improve their financial position. By now she was in her mid-40s, and both of her daughters were married. She didn't want to stay too long in the house that Charles had built, so decided to start a child adoption service. At the time, women who gave birth outside marriage were considered to have a lack of moral character, and with few methods of contraception, adoption services are often seen to be a lucrative business. Minnie, however, would not just arrange for babies to be adopted, she would also look after children while their parents worked or tried to make their own arrangements as to how and where their child would be raised. At first, this service proved popular and her reputation grew. The couple's financial position started to improve, and as more young women approached Minnie for help, more babies and very young children arrived at the house. The infant mortality rate in New Zealand at the time was 10%, so it was not altogether a surprise, but some of the infants died while under her care. In March 1889, a 6-month-old child died, another in October 1891, and as she was taking on more infants, there were rumours in Winton that some of them had gone missing. The authorities and the public were aware of the case of Margaret Waters, who was hanged in London in 1870. She had advertised her adoption service and was contacted by desperate mothers who needed to find a suitable home for their child. But instead of doing so, Margaret neglected the babies until they eventually died. Following the 2 infant deaths, the authorities decided to look more closely at the services provided by Mrs. Minnie Dean. At the time, there was no legislation into how childcare should be operated, and anyone who had a childcare and adoption service was not required to keep records, so proving the rumours that children had disappeared while under her care was going to be difficult. An inquest was held to ascertain if Minnie was accountable for the deaths in 1889 and 1891, but it eventually concluded that she could not be considered responsible. The judge did, however, comment that in his opinion, she kept too many children in her small home, as it had been reported that as many as 9 had been present there at any one time. The house was also described as dirty and overcrowded, and a totally inadequate premises from which to run a child care and adoption service. Following the inquest, young ladies stopped bringing their children to Minnie, and the police started to note what was happening at the Larches. Minnie, however, started to advertise her services by using an assumed name. Later, it was alleged that she had inquired into the possibility of taking out life insurance policies on the children she cared for. In 1893, she travelled to Christchurch to collect a 3-week-old baby who she had agreed to put up for adoption. She stayed at a boarding house. The owner, however, became so concerned about the way Minnie treated the child, she contacted the police. When they arrived, they removed the poor baby from Minnie's care. Minnie continued placing adverts in newspapers, stating that she was a respectable married woman with no young children who was looking for a baby to nurse or adopt. And babies continued to pass through her small house in Winton. So many, in fact, that the police commissioner became increasingly worried about her child care and adoption service, and eventually wrote to the Minister of Justice, outlining his concerns. On April the 29th, 1895, Minnie travelled to Bluff to collect a young baby named Dorothy Carter. She then returned to Winton. 3 days later, on the 2nd of May, she travelled by train from Winton to Lumsden. Somewhat strangely, for someone who usually wanted to remain inconspicuous, she was carrying the baby in a hat box. She was noticed by the conductor, as well as other passengers. However, when she got off the train at Lumsden, no one saw the baby, just the hat box. The conductor wondered what had happened to the baby, so reported it to the police. Minnie had booked a boarding house in Lumsden, and the next day returned to the railway station, where she took a train travelling north towards Dunedin. She got off the train at Milburn and left her hat box in the luggage area before meeting a lady named Mrs. Hornsby, who gave Minnie her 1-month-old granddaughter named Eva and payment for her service. She then retrieved her hat box and boarded the train for the long journey back to Winton. Although fellow passengers and the conductor thought that her hat box seemed particularly heavy, no one reported that there was a baby inside it. The police followed up on the information provided by the conductor and decided to search the train line, but it was 30 miles from Winton to Lumsden, and despite their best efforts, their search didn't find anything. They continued to investigate the disappearance. It was only 2 years since the New Zealand newspapers had reported the case from Sydney, Australia, of John and Sarah Jane Makin, who ran an agency that placed babies of unmarried mothers with childless couples, but who in 1893 had been found guilty of the murder of Horace Murray, who was one of the infants in their care. John was hanged and his wife sentenced to life in prison. With this in mind, the authorities decided to look more closely at the reported disappearance of the baby, and the newspapers started to report the incident. When Mrs. Hornsby read about it, she contacted the police and told them how she had met a lady at Milburn and entrusted her with her 1-month-old granddaughter. From Mrs. Hornsby's description, the police thought that the lady she had given the baby to may have been Mrs. Minnie Dean. On their return to Winton, the police made their way to the Larches to speak to Minnie. They asked to see little Eva, but she was not there. Minnie and Childs were arrested. They searched the house and asked Mrs. Hornsby if she recognised any of the baby clothing that they had found. Mrs. Hornsby confirmed, but some items had belonged to Eva. With no sign of the baby, it was decided that on the 11th of May, the police should dig up the Dean's garden. It didn't take long for them to make a gruesome discovery. They uncovered 3 bodies, one of a baby, and the others of children of around a year and 3 years old. The baby was identified to be Eva. A post-mortem was conducted, which ascertained that she had died from suffocation, The 1-year-old was identified to be Dorothy Edith Carter, who had died from an overdose of laudanum, but the pathologist was unable to determine how the 3-year-old had died. Following the investigation and the discovery of the bodies, Charles Dean was released, while his wife Wilhelmina was charged with murder. The trial of Wilhelmina Dean began on the 18th of June 1895 in Invercargill. The press and the public seemed convinced that she had committed the crimes for which she was accused, but Minnie pleaded not guilty. Witnesses described how on the 30th of April, the defendant had collected baby Dorothy and then taken her back to Winton. She then took her with her on the journey to collect Eva. All the witnesses, however, said that on the return journey, the accused was not seen with any babies, just a very heavy hat box, which he struggled to carry. She was represented by a young lawyer named Alfred Hanlon, who informed the court that all the deaths were accidental. He said that his client had buried the bodies in the garden to prevent a repeat of the adverse publicity she had previously been subjected to following the inquest in 1891. When he cross-examined the lady who had handed Dorothy to Minnie, she confirmed that although a financial agreement had been made, no money had been paid to the defendant. The press reported every detail of the trial, and souvenirs were sold outside the court, the most popular being tiny dolls in miniature hat boxes. Minnie claimed that Eva had died as she gave her laudanum to help her sleep, but she miscalculated the dose. When she realised what had happened, she panicked, put her back in the hat box, and buried her alongside 2 other children who had also died. It was difficult for the authorities to establish the exact number of children who had resided at the Larches. In addition to those who were legally adopted, 26 others were believed to have been looked after by Wilhelmina. 6 were confirmed to have died, 1 was returned to his family, and 5 children were living at the house when she was arrested. As no records were kept, what happened to the others was not known, but Wilhelmina claimed that they were adopted by families who wished to keep their identities secret. The newspapers were not convinced and surmised that she had probably been responsible for the deaths of the children who were unaccounted for. On the 21st of June 1895, the trial ended and the jury were sent out to deliberate. They returned to find the defendant guilty, and the judge sentenced Wilhelmina Dean to death. She was taken to prison, where she spent the next 2 months writing an account of her life. On the 12th of August 1895, Mrs. Wilhelmina Dean was taken from her cell at Invercargill prison to the gallows. She was asked if she had anything to say, and she replied, "I have nothing to say, except that I am innocent." Following her execution, she was buried at the cemetery in Winton. Her husband was buried alongside her after his death in 1908 following a house fire. After the trial, the New Zealand government introduced new child welfare legislation. Wilhelmina Dean is the only woman to be hanged by the state in New Zealand. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case